London, 1937. Behind the velvet curtains of the Alwood Community Theatre, the Briar Lane players prepare for a final rehearsal. A comedy, they say, about love and laughter and a harmless little murder. But the stage has a way of turning lies into truth. Under the bright lights, actors whisper their lines, knives gleam in the props table, and jealousy hides behind powdered faces. To them, it's all pretend until the leading lady falls and the laughter stops. The audience gasps. The director freezes. The stage knife, meant to retract, does not. When Hercule Poirot rises from the front row, he already knows one thing. The performance was perfect except for the murder. And when Miss Jane Marple appears in the wings, she sees something else. Not in the props or the stage, but in the people, the glances, the pride, the quiet cruelty behind applause. Together, they will discover that the killer didn't switch the weapon, they switched the story itself. Before we begin, subscribe to Whispering Ages, where every clue hides behind civility and every mystery begins in plain sight. And tell me in the comments, if life were a play, how far would someone go to rewrite their ending? The Final Curtain, a mystery featuring Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 1. The Curtain Rises. The autumn fog hung thick over London streets that October evening in 1937, curling around lampposts and muffling the sound of motor cars as they rumbled past the modest facade of the Alwood Community Theatre. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a narrow Edwardian structure wedged between the tobacconist's shop and the tea room. But within its walls, ambition burned as brightly as the footlights that illuminated its worn stage. Hercule Poirot adjusted his silk scarf with fastidious care as he stepped from the taxi, his patent leather shoes clicking against the wet pavement. He had not anticipated spending his Friday evening at an amateur theatrical production, but his old acquaintance Inspector James Craddock had been insistent. "My niece is performing, Poirot," Craddock had explained over luncheon earlier that week. "She's quite talented, really, and the theater itself is rather charming. All the drama of the West End compressed into a space no larger than a country drawing room." Poirot had smiled at this description, his green eyes twinkling with amusement. "And you wish me to accompany you because my wife is taken ill with a cold, and I cannot bear to disappoint Margaret by arriving alone. You're a cultured man, Poirot. Surely an evening of theater won't offend your sensibilities." And so Poirot found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the theater's entrance, where a hand-painted sign announced in enthusiastic letters, "The Briar Lane Players Present. A Lady Dies Laughing. A Comedy in 3 acts." The lobby was cramped but cheerful, decorated with playbills from previous productions and smelling faintly of furniture polish and grease paint. A young woman with bright eyes took their coats, and Craddock led Poirot through a set of double doors into the theater proper. The auditorium was intimate indeed. Perhaps 10 rows of seats facing a stage that looked scarcely large enough to accommodate more than 3 actors at once. Red velvet curtains framed proscenium, their fabric worn soft with age and use. The ceiling was decorated with peeling plasterwork cherubs, and the walls were lined with sconces that cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled audience. "There are perhaps 40 seats in total," Poirot observed, settling into his chair in the 4th row. "This is most cozy." "Community theater, oh boy," Craddock replied with a grin. "But don't let the size fool you. Some of these amateur companies are quite serious about their craft. Margaret says the director is a real tyrant about rehearsals." Before Poirot could respond, a voice called out from several rows behind them, "Inspector Craddock, how delightful to see you here." Both men turned to see an elderly woman making her way down the aisle with surprising agility. She was small and neat, with white hair arranged in soft waves beneath a modest hat, and she wore a sensible tweed coat over a lavender dress. Her eyes, however, were anything but ordinary. They were sharp and observant, missing nothing as they swept over the theater and its occupants. Miss Marple. Craddock rose to his feet, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I had no idea you were in London. I'm visiting my dear friend Emily Drake." Miss Marple explained, gesturing vaguely toward the stage. She's the wardrobe mistress here, and she insisted I attend this evening's dress rehearsal. She said, and I quote, "Real theater folk are just like villagers, Jane. All scandal and tea." Naturally, I couldn't resist. Craddock laughed and introduced her to Poirot, who bowed over her hand with continental courtesy. "Miss Marple and I met during the Chipping Cleghorn affair," Craddock explained. "She has quite a remarkable mind for solving puzzles." "You flatter me, Inspector," Miss Marple said modestly, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "I simply observe people. Human nature is much the same whether in St. Mary Mead or London, I find." "Mademoiselle," Poirot said with interest, "you're a student of human nature? Then we have much in common. I, too, believe that the psychology, she is the key to all mysteries." "How nice to meet a kindred spirit," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I do hope the play is entertaining, though Emily warned me the rehearsals have been rather fraught. Apparently, there's been quite a bit of tension among the cast." "Tension?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Oh, the usual theatrical drama, I expect. Jealousies, romantic entanglements, artistic differences. Emily says their leading lady is quite temperamental, though very talented." Before the conversation could continue, the house lights flickered, a signal that the performance was about to begin. Miss Marple excused herself to find her seat several rows back, and Poirot settled in beside Craddock with his hands folded neatly over the top of his walking stick. The curtains parted to reveal a drawing-room set, complete with sofa, several chairs, and a painted fireplace. The furniture was mismatched, clearly borrowed from various sources, but the effect was charming in its sincerity. For the next hour and a half, Poirot watched with growing amusement as the comedy unfolded. The plot concerned a country house party where various guests harbored secrets, and the lady of the house, played by the aforementioned leading lady, threatened to expose them all. The dialogue sparkled with wit, and the actors, while clearly amateur, brought enthusiasm to their roles. The leading lady, Vera Harcourt, was indeed talented. She commanded the stage with natural grace, her timing impeccable, her gestures theatrical without being excessive. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair arranged in fashionable waves, and a figure that the emerald evening gown displayed to advantage. When she spoke, her voice carried effortlessly to the back of the house, rich and melodious. Her leading man, Gerald Penn, was equally striking, tall and handsome with features that would have looked at home on a matinee idol. Yet Poirot detected something rigid in his performance, a quality of suppressed anger that occasionally broke through the comedy. The director, a thin man with nervous hands who sat in the front row calling out occasional notes, seemed to grow more agitated as the play progressed. More than once, Poirot heard him mutter to himself or scratch frantically in a notebook. As the play entered its third and final act, the mood shifted. The comedy grew darker, the secrets more dangerous. The scene built toward its climax, a confrontation between Vera's character and her guests, followed by a mock murder that would end the play on a laugh. "Now comes a famous death scene," Craddock whispered to Poirot. "Margaret says it's quite clever, meant to send up all those melodramatic murder mysteries." The stage was set for finale. Vera stood center stage, her back to a painted window, as Gerald Penn's character confronted her with evidence of her blackmail. The dialogue crackled with tension, though the audience knew it was meant to be parody. "You think you can control us all with your secrets," Penn declared, brandishing a stage knife that glinted in the footlights. "But I'll see you silenced first." "Then do it," Vera laughed, her voice rich with mockery. "But know that the truth dies harder than flesh, and someone will always—" She never finished the sentence. As Penn thrust the knife toward her in what should have been an obviously theatrical gesture, Vera's expression changed. The mocking smile vanished, replaced by genuine shock. Her hands flew to her chest, where the knife had struck, and when she pulled them away, they were wet with blood. "No," she whispered, her voice suddenly small and confused. "This isn't." She staggered backward, her legs buckling, and collapsed on the stage with a sound that was sickeningly real. Not the graceful swoon of an actress, but the dead-weight fall of a body suddenly beyond its owner's control. For a moment, the theater was utterly silent. Everyone assumed it was part of the performance, perhaps a particularly realistic bit of stagecraft. Then the blood began to pool beneath her, dark and unmistakable, and Gerald Penn's scream shattered the silence. Poirot was on his feet before he was conscious of moving, his walking stick clattering to the floor. "Mon Dieu!" he breathed, staring at the stage where Vera Harcourt lay perfectly still. The comedy has become a tragedy. Chapter 2. The Curtain Falls. The next 10 minutes were chaos. Gerald Penn stood frozen over Vera's body, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand, his face a mask of horror. Someone in the audience screamed. The director, Martin Greaves, vaulted onto the stage with surprising agility, shouting for a doctor even as he knelt beside the fallen actress. Inspector Craddock moved with the swift efficiency of long training. "Nobody leave," he commanded, his voice cutting to the pandemonium. "Stay in your seats. You," he pointed at the young woman who had taken their coats, "telephone Scotland Yard immediately. Tell them we need police and an ambulance at the Alwood Community Theater. And you," this to a stagehand who stood gaping in the wings, "lock all the exits. No one enters or leaves this building." Poirot had already climbed the short stairs to the stage, moving with surprising speed for a man of his build. He knelt beside Martin Greaves, his experienced eyes taking in what his heart already knew to be true. Vera Harcourt was dead. The knife had entered her chest with surgical precision, piercing her heart. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, though her final moment of confusion suggested she had not immediately understood what was happening. "Don't touch anything," Poirot said sharply as Greaves reached for the knife. "We must preserve the scene." "But she might still be—" Greaves began desperately. "Non, monsieur. I regret, but there is nothing to be done. The lady, she is gone." Behind them, Gerald Penn was making a terrible keening sound, still staring at his bloody hands. A woman had climbed onto the stage and was trying to lead him away. A slim, plain woman of about 30 whom Poirot would later learn was Clara Bennett, the understudy. By the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, Craddock had managed to impose order. The handful of audience members, perhaps 10 in total, as this was only a dress rehearsal, were gathered in the first few rows, their faces pale and shocked. The theater staff and remaining cast members had been assembled on the stage itself, well away from the body. Miss Marple had moved quietly to comfort a stout woman in an apron who was weeping softly, Mrs. Emily Drake, the wardrobe mistress who had invited her. Poirot observed that even in her distress, Miss Marple's eyes remained alert, cataloguing details. Detective Chief Inspector Morton of Scotland Yard arrived with a police surgeon and several constables. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and the air of someone who had seen too much of humanity's worst to be easily surprised. Yet even he looked shaken by the scene that greeted him. "Inspector Craddock," he said with a nod of recognition, "you've secured the scene?" "As best I could, sir. The building is locked. I have names for everyone present." Craddock hesitated. "I should mention that Monsieur Hercule Poirot was in the audience. He's offered his assistance." Morton's eyebrows rose. "Poirot? The Belgian detective? Well, I don't say no to expert help. What do we got?" While the police surgeon examined the body and the photographer began his grim work, Poirot laid out what he had observed. The play was a comedy, Chief Inspector, which ends with mock murder using a theatrical knife, one that you retract into its handle when pressure is applied. But this knife... He gestured to the weapon that now lay on the floor beside Vera's body, carefully marked by the police. "This knife is real. You can see from the blood and the nature of the wound. No theatrical prop could have inflicted such damage." "Someone switched the knives," Morton said grimly. "So it would appear. The question is when and how and by whom." Poirot's eyes scanned the stage. "And why no one noticed?" The police surgeon looked up from his examination. Death was virtually instantaneous. The blade penetrated the heart cleanly. She would have lost consciousness within seconds. He paused. She's wearing some kind of padding beneath her costume, likely for the fall that was meant to come at the end of the scene. But it didn't protect her. The knife went right through. Poirot moved closer to examine the costume, an emerald evening gown that was now ruined beyond repair. The fabric around the wound was stiff with drying blood, but he could see traces of something else as well. "There is grease paint here," he observed, "on the dress and on the knife handle." And he leaned in, his nose wrinkling. Perfume, a distinctive scent, lilac, I think, and something else, bergamot. She was an actress, Morton said dismissively. They were makeup and perfume. But the grease paint is smeared, as though someone handled a knife after touching their face. And the perfume, Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. It may be significant. Miss Marple had quietly approached. Mrs. Drake, still clinging to her arm. "Forgive me for interrupting, Chief Inspector, but I wonder if I might mention something?" Morton looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "And you are—" "Miss Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I'm visiting Mrs. Drake here. She's the wardrobe mistress. I happen to be in the audience for the dress rehearsal. A witness, then, will take your statement." "Yes, of course. But it's not about what I saw during the performance. It's about what I noticed before." Miss Marple's gentle voice was deceptively casual. "You see, Vera, Miss Harcourt, changed her costume just before the final act. She came to the wardrobe room where Emily, Mrs. Drake, and I were having tea during the interval. She said something about the original dress being too tight and asked for adjustments to this one." "That's right," Mrs. Drake said, her voice trembling. She was very particular. Wanted everything perfect for the final scene. "And did anyone else enter the wardrobe room during this time?" Poirot asked with sudden interest. Mrs. Drake shook her head. "No, just us three. Though—" She hesitated. "Though the door to the prop room is adjacent to the wardrobe room. I keep both keys on my chatelaine." She touched the silver chain at her waist, from which several keys dangled. "But when Vera left, I noticed the wardrobe key was missing. I thought I'd just misplaced it in the bustle, but now, Poirot said softly, "we must consider that someone took it, and that same someone may have had access to both rooms." Inspector Craddock had been organizing the witnesses, and now he approached Morton. "Everyone's accounted for, sir. Besides the victim, we have 5 members of the cast and crew on the premises. Gerald Penn, the leading man, Martin Greaves, the director, Clara Bennett, the understudy, and Mr. and Mrs. Drake, who own the theater and serve as financier and wardrobe mistress respectively. There's also the stagehand, Timothy Wells, and the woman at the coat check, Margaret Craddock, my niece." "Your niece?" Morton frowned. "That's irregular. She's a university student, sir, helping out for pocket money. She only works the coat check and has nothing to do with production itself." Morton sighed. "Very well. We'll need statements from everyone. Set up in—" He looked around the cramped theater. "I suppose the green room will have to do." "Chief Inspector," Poirot said, drawing Morton aside, "with your permission, I would like to examine the prop room and wardrobe room while the scene is still fresh. And perhaps—" He glanced at Miss Marple. "Mademoiselle Marple might accompany me? She has already demonstrated excellent powers of observation." Morton looked skeptical. An elderly lady playing a detective. "I assure you, sir," Craddock interjected, "Miss Marple may look harmless, but she has assisted in several complex cases. Her insights into human nature are quite remarkable. Do not underestimate the gossip, mon ami," Poirot added with a slight smile. "It is often the cousin of truth. And Miss Marple, I suspect, knows how to listen to what people do not say." Morton threw up his hands. "Fine, but stay out of my officer's way. And Poirot, Anything you find, report to me immediately. Mais naturellement, Poirot assured him, as the police began the systematic work of interviewing witnesses and cataloging evidence. Poirot and Miss Marple made their way backstage. The narrow corridors were cluttered with props and costume racks, the walls lined with photographs of past seductions. The smell of dust and cosmetics hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Drake, having composed herself somewhat, led them to the wardrobe room. It was a small space crammed with clothing racks, a sewing machine, and a table strewn with thread, needles, and costume jewelry. A door in the far wall stood slightly ajar. "That's the prop room," Mrs. Drake explained. "We share the space, you see. It's more efficient." Poirot examined the prop room with the methodical care of an expert. It was even smaller than a wardrobe room, with shelves holding various items. Fake flowers, painted swords, prop weapons, glasses, bottles. In the center stood a wooden chest with a padlock. "The prop box," Mrs. Drake said. "Timothy, the stagehand. He locks it after every use. Says it keeps things organized." "And who has access to this key?" Poirot asked, examining the padlock. "Timothy keeps it on his person. He's very protective of his props." Poirot knelt beside the box, his keen eyes studying the scratches around the lock. "Curious," he murmured. "There are marks here, fresh ones. Someone has opened this box recently, and perhaps not with perfect skill." He straightened and turned his attention to the interior of the room. Near the door, he found what he was seeking, a smudge of grease paint on the door frame, at about shoulder height. "Someone touched this," he said, after applying stage makeup. "See how the color is transferred." Miss Marple had been examining the wardrobe room, and now she called softly, "Monsieur Poirot, I think you should see this." In her hand, she held a small piece of paper, torn from a larger sheet. The paper was of good quality, with the theater's letterhead faintly visible at the top, but it was a handwriting that caught Poirot's attention, a woman's elegant script in blue ink. "No one will laugh this time. Where did you find this?" Poirot asked sharply. "In the pocket of Miss Harcourt's original dress, the one she changed out of before the final act. It was folded very small, as though she wanted to keep it hidden." Poirot took the paper and studied it carefully in the light. "This is most interesting, mademoiselle, most interesting indeed. For you see, this line, it is not in the play." "You're certain?" "I have an excellent memory for dialogue. The play we watched, it was witty and light. This line," he tapped the paper, "this has the quality of a threat, or perhaps a warning." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "When people write notes like this, in my experience, it's because they're trying to change an ending they don't like. Though whether it was Miss Harcourt or someone else who wrote it, I couldn't say." "We must discover the authorship," Poirot agreed. "Come, let us return to the others. I think it is time to speak with the players in this drama." Chapter 3. The Cast of Suspects. The green room was a cramped but comfortable space, furnished with mismatched chairs, a worn sofa, and a mirror surrounded by bare light bulbs. Theatrical posters covered the walls, and a small table held a kettle and an assortment of chipped cups. It was here that Chief Inspector Morton had set up his temporary headquarters, methodically interviewing each person connected to the theater. Poirot and Miss Marple entered quietly, observing the group assembled there. Each face told a story of shock, fear, and in some cases, guilt, though whether that guilt was born of murder or merely a survival, Poirot could not yet say. Gerald Penn sat alone in the corner, his head in his hands. He had been allowed to wash the blood from his hands, but had refused to change out his costume, a dinner jacket now marked with dark stains. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with the kind of classical features that photograph well, but his face was haggard, aged by shock. Martin Greaves paced nervously near the window, his thin frame practically vibrating with tension. He was younger than Poirot had initially thought, perhaps 32 or 33, with sandy hair that kept falling into his eyes. He pushed it back with quick, jerky movements, muttering to himself. Clara Bennett, the understudy, had made tea that no one was drinking. She was a slight woman with mousy brown hair and unremarkable features, the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd. But her hands were steady as she poured, and her eyes, when she looked up, held a surprising intelligence. Hugh Drake, the theater owner, stood apart from the others, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He was a big man in his 50s, with a red face and thinning hair, dressed in an expensive but rumpled suit. Everything about him suggested a man barely containing his temper. His wife, Emily, sat on the sofa, still occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She was perhaps 45, comfortably stout, with a kind face and gentle manner. Miss Marple had positioned herself beside her, offering quiet comfort. Timothy Wells, the stagehand, was a young man of perhaps 25, lean and nervous. He kept touching his pockets as though checking for something. Inspector Craddock was coordinating with the other police officers, but he caught Poirot's eye and came over. "Any luck backstage?" he asked quietly. Poirot showed him the torn note. "We found this in the victim's clothing. I believe it may be significant. Have any of the witnesses mentioned threats or unusual communications?" "Not yet, but we're just starting the formal interviews. Morton wants them done in order of proximity to the victim." He lowered his voice. "Penn is in a bad state. He and Vera Harcourt were engaged once, apparently. Broke it off 2 years ago, but there's been tension between them ever since." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "The crime of passion, perhaps? The jealous lover? It's possible. He had means. He was holding the knife. An opportunity. He was right there when she died. But," Miss Marple interjected gently, "he would also be the most obvious suspect, wouldn't he? And in my experience, murderers who plan their crimes usually try to avoid being the obvious suspect." Poirot smiled at her. "Mademoiselle makes an excellent point. Still, we must consider all possibilities." Morton emerged from his makeshift office, actually a storage room adjacent to the green room, and called out, "Gerald Penn, you're next." Penn looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't kill her," he said hoarsely. "I loved her." "Save it for the interview," Morton said, not unkindly. "Come along." As Penn rose and followed Morton, Poirot approached Martin Greaves. "Monsieur le Directeur," he said courteously, "may I offer my condolences? This must be a terrible shock." Greaves looked at him with wild eyes. "Shock? It's a nightmare. The play, my play, turned into a murder scene. How am I supposed to... How can anyone... The play," Poirot said thoughtfully. "Tell me, monsieur, was it always intended to end with a murder?" "What? Yes, of course. It's a parody of murder mysteries. The whole point was to mock the genre while also celebrating it. The audience was supposed to laugh when Vera fell. They were supposed to think it was all very clever, very meta. Meta? Poirot repeated the unfamiliar word. Self-referential, Clara Bennett supplied quietly from across the room. The play was about itself, in a way. "Ah, I understand. And this ending, it was written by..." "The playwright is a local man, Edward Marsh. He's been writing for us for years. This was supposed to be his masterpiece." Greaves laughed bitterly. "Now it's ruined. Everything's ruined. Were there any changes to the script recently?" Poirot asked casually. "Any rewrites or modifications?" Greaves hesitated. Vera wanted to change some of her lines. She always did that. Thought she knew better than the writer. I told her no, but she... He trailed off, his face flushing. "She insisted?" Vera always got her way. There was something in Greaves' voice, not quite anger, but close to it. Poirot filed this observation away. Miss Marple had been speaking quietly with Mrs. Drake, and now she caught Poirot's attention with a subtle gesture. He excused himself from Greaves and joined her. "Emily has just told me something rather interesting," Miss Marple said. "It seems Miss Harcourt had been receiving anonymous notes for the past week." Mrs. Drake nodded, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. "Vera showed me one of them. It said, oh, what were the exact words? Something like, You cannot change the ending that was written. I thought it was just some crank. We get those sometimes. People get too involved in plays. Did she report these notes to anyone? Poirot asked. She laughed them off. Said anyone who could write something so melodramatic clearly didn't understand good theater. Mrs. Drake's voice shook. But she kept them, I know she did. She had them in her dressing room. Then we must examine her dressing room, Poirot said decisively. Inspector Craddock. Craddock came over, and Poirot explained what they had learned. The dressing room should be searched thoroughly. There may be other notes or correspondence that could shed light on the victim's recent state of mind. I'll tell Morton, Craddock agreed, though he's got his hands full with pen at the moment. The poor man is barely coherent. Through the wall, they could hear Morton's voice raise in frustration, and Penn's responses, too muffled to make out clearly, but clearly emotional. Poirot turned to Hugh Drake. Monsieur Drake, may I ask you some questions? Drake glared at him. Who the devil are you? I am Hercule Poirot, a private detective. I am assisting the police. Well, I've got nothing to hide. Ask away. You own this theater, yes? My father owned it. I inherited it when he died 5 years ago. It's been in the Drake family for 30 years. And it is profitable? Drake's face darkened. That's none of your business. On the contrary, Poirot said mildly, in a murder investigation, finances are always relevant. Financial trouble can be a powerful motive. Are you accusing me of something? I accuse no one. I merely gather information. Mrs. Drake spoke up, her voice trembling. Hugh, please. The man is just doing his job. She looked at Poirot. The theater hasn't been profitable in years. We've been hemorrhaging money. He wanted to sell it, but I love this place. It's my whole life. Emily, Drake warned. No, I won't be quiet. If we're all under suspicion, we might as well be honest. She turned to Poirot. We've been using our savings to keep the theater running. Another few months, and we'd have been bankrupt. And did Miss Harcourt know this? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Drake nodded miserably. She knew everything. She had a way of finding things out. She told me last week that if we couldn't pay for new costumes, she'd go to the newspapers and tell them the Alwick was a sinking ship. Those were her exact words. She was blackmailing you? Craddock asked sharply. Not for money. She just wanted everything her way. New costumes, new sets, star billing. She said if we couldn't give her what she deserved, she'd make sure everyone knew we were failing. Mrs. Drake was crying now. But I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. Emily. Hugh Drake moved to his wife's side, his face furious. Don't say another word without a solicitor. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room was now looking at Mrs. Drake with new suspicion. Poirot held up his hand. Please, let us not jump to conclusions. Many people had reasons to dislike Mademoiselle Harcourt, it seems. That does not make them murderers. He turned to Clara Bennet, who had remained silent throughout the exchanges. And you, Mademoiselle, you were the understudy? Clara looked up, startled. Yes, but I would never... people always suspect the understudy, don't they? But I didn't want Vera to die. I just wanted... She stopped, biting her lip. You just wanted what? Poirot prompted gently. A chance to perform, Clara said quietly. Just once. I wanted to know what it was like to stand center stage and feel the lights on me. Vera had that every day. She took it for granted. But I would never hurt anyone for it. I'm not brave enough to kill someone. It was such an honest admission that Poirot found himself believing her. But belief and proof were different things. Timothy Wells, the stagehand, had been listening to all this with growing agitation. Now he burst out, This is mad, all of you with your motives and your secrets. But the knife, someone switched the real knife for the prop. That's what we should be talking about. Who had access to the prop room? An excellent question, Poirot agreed. Tell me, Monsieur Wells, you keep the prop box locked, yes? Always. I'm responsible for every item. If something goes missing, it's my job on the line. And where was this key during the performance? Wells patted his vest pocket. Right here. It never leaves me. Then how? Poirot asked, did someone open the prop box to retrieve a real knife? For clearly they did. Wells' face went pale. I don't know. The lock wasn't forced. You checked yourself. You said there were scratches, but the lock still worked. So either someone picked the lock, or Poirot paused, or someone made a copy of your key. That's impossible. I'm the only one. Wells stopped, realization dawning on his face. Wait, 2 weeks ago, I lost the key for a day. I thought I'd just misplaced it, and then it turned up again in my jacket. But if someone took it and made a copy, you fool. Hugh Drake exploded. You lost the key and didn't tell anyone? I found it again. It was only missing for a few hours. Craddock made a note. We'll need to know where you lost it and who had access to your jacket during that time. Before Wells could answer, Morton emerged from his interview with Gerald Penn. He looked frustrated. Penn swears he had nothing to do with it. Morton announced the room at large. Claims he was holding the prop knife exactly as rehearsed. Never deviated from the choreography. Says the knife must have been switched before he picked it up for the scene. That would narrow the time window considerably, Poirot mused. The knife would have been placed with the other props before the final act. Someone switched them during that interval. The interval lasted 20 minutes, Greaves said. Long enough for someone to get backstage and make the switch. But who? Clara asked. We were all in the green room during the interval, except. Except who? Morton demanded. Except Vera. She wanted to change her costume. All eyes turned to Mrs. Drake, who looked stricken. She was with me in the wardrobe room. I helped her with the fasteners. And after that? Poirot asked. She left to go back to her dressing room. But she was only gone for a few minutes. Surely not long enough to enter the prop room and switch the knives? Poirot finished. Perhaps, but why would she arrange her own murder? It was a question no one could answer. Chapter 4, the scene of the crime. The following morning, Poirot returned to the Alwick Theatre accompanied by Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock had arranged their access, though Chief Inspector Morton had insisted that a police constable be present at all times. The theater looked different in daylight, or rather, in the gray morning light that filtered through the high windows. The magic of the stage was gone, replaced by harsh reality. The blood stain where Vera Harcourt had fallen had been marked and documented, and the stage itself looked bare and sad, without its actors. Poirot stood center stage, his eyes closed, reconstructing the scene in his mind. She was standing here, he murmured, moving to the precise spot where Vera had fallen. Gerald Penn approached from stage left, the knife in his hand. He raises it. So, and then the thrust, yes? But she is not expecting the real blade. She thinks it is all performance. Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the stage, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The audience would have been watching from here, she said, standing at the edge where the stage met the auditorium. About 10 people, Emily said, all focused on the actors. No one looking at the wings or the prop table. Precisely. The perfect moment for a murder. In plain sight, yet invisible because everyone expects the illusion. Poirot opened his eyes. But the knife, mademoiselle, there's something about the knife that troubles me. He moved to the prop table in the wings, where the police had left everything as it was found. There were 2 knives laid out side by side, each now tagged with evidence labels. They were identical in appearance, both with ornate hilts and 12-inch blades that caught the light. This one, Poirot said, pointing to the first, is a theatrical knife. You see, when I pressed the hilt. He demonstrated carefully, and the blade retracted into the handle with a soft click. Clever, non? It appears to penetrate, but in truth it collapses. And the other? Miss Marple asked, though she already knew the answer. is quite real. A genuine dagger, antique if I am not mistaken. Spanish work, perhaps 18th century, worth a considerable sum. He examined it closely without touching. There are traces of grease paint on the hilt, as we observed last night. And here, do you see, mademoiselle? A tiny smudge of red. Lipstick, Miss Marple suggested. I think so, yes. A distinctive shade, crimson, not scarlet. We must discover who wore such a color. The constable who had been assigned to watch them cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, sir, but Chief Inspector Morton said you weren't to touch anything. But naturally I touch nothing. I only observe. Poirot smiled. Tell me, young man, were you here last night when the scene was photographed? Yes, sir. I assisted with the measurements. And the position of the knives, they were both on this table when you arrived? That's right, sir. The prop knife was here. He indicated a spot near the stage entrance, and the real knife was on the floor where Mr. Penn dropped it after happened. But before the murder, where was the real knife kept? The constable consulted his notes. According to Mr. Wells, the stagehand, it was normally displayed in a locked cabinet in the prop room. Decorative piece, part of the theater's collection. He noticed it was missing during the interval, but he thought someone had just moved it. And did he report this? He says he mentioned it to Mr. Greaves, the director, but Greaves was too focused on last-minute notes for the final act. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. So the killer removed the real knife from its case, brought it to the prop table, and switched it for the theatrical knife, all during a 20-minute interval when the cast and crew were supposedly together in the green room. Supposedly? Miss Marple caught the emphasis. Ah, but that is the question, is it not? Where was everyone during those crucial minutes? They made their way to Vera Harcourt's dressing room. It was a small space, crowded with flowers, photographs, and the paraphernalia of an actress's life. A mirror surrounded by lights dominated one wall, its surface still cluttered with cosmetics. A wardrobe stood open, costumes hanging in careful arrangement. Such vanity, Miss Marple observed, looking at the photographs that covered nearly every surface. They all featured Vera in various roles, Vera accepting flowers, Vera with other actors, always positioned prominently in the center. She was a woman who loved the spotlight. Poirot agreed. But look here, what is this? He had found a small escritoire in the corner, its surface covered with papers. There were scripts, of course, but also letters, newspaper clippings, and, as Mrs. Drake had suggested, several notes written on cheap paper in an angry, cramped hand. Poirot read them aloud. You cannot change what was written. The ending has been decided. Rewrite your part, and you rewrite your fate. No one will laugh this time. That last one, Miss Marple said, matches the note we found in her pocket. Indeed, but you see the handwriting, mademoiselle? It is not the same. The note in her pocket was written in an elegant, feminine hand. These notes are masculine, perhaps, or at least written by someone in great agitation. He examined them more closely. They are all postmarked from London, sent to the theater over the past 10 days. Someone was warning her, threatening her perhaps not to change the play. But why would changing a few lines in an amateur production matter so much? Miss Marple wondered aloud. An excellent question. Poirot continued his search of the desk. In a drawer, he found something that made him pause, a journal, bound in red leather, with Vera's initials embossed in gold. Dare we? He asked, looking at the constable. Evidence is evidence, sir. The chief inspector will want to see it anyway. Poirot opened the journal carefully. The entries were sporadic, written in Vera's flowing script, full of theatrical observations and gossip, but the most recent entries from the past 2 weeks took a different tone. October 10th. Gerald cornered me after rehearsal again. Still hasn't accepted that we're finished. He says I'm making a mistake leaving the Briar Lane players for the West End, that I'm betraying everything we built together. But he never understood this was always meant to be temporary. I was always meant for something greater. October 14th. Martin is pathetic. He gave me a letter today. Can you imagine? A love letter, as if we were characters in some Victorian romance. I returned it without reading it. He must understand that I feel nothing for him. He's a competent director, nothing more. October 18th. The anonymous notes continue. Someone doesn't want me to change the ending. But they don't understand. I'm not changing the ending. I'm revealing the truth. The play was always a lie, a comfortable fiction. What I've written is real. October 21st. I've finished my revisions. The final scene will be different. So different. They all think it's still a comedy. But I've turned it into something else entirely. When I speak those lines tomorrow night, everyone will know. Gerald will know what a fool he was. Marta will know I could never love someone so weak. And the Drakes. Oh, the Drakes will understand that their precious theater was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. The truth will be glorious. Poirot closed the journal slowly. Mon Dieu, he breathed. She was not just changing lines. She was planning to expose everyone. During performance, Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. But surely that's mad? Reckless? All of these things. But it was also very much in character for Mademoiselle Harcourt, I think. She saw the stage as her kingdom, and the final performance as her moment of triumph. But someone made sure she never got that moment, the constable observed grimly. Poirot nodded. We must speak with Martin Greaves about this letter she mentions, and we must discover what, exactly, she had written in her revised script. They found Greaves at a small flat in Bloomsbury, a cramped two-room affair cluttered with books and scripts. He answered the door in his dressing gown, unshaven and red-eyed. Monsieur Poirot, he said dully, I suppose you're here to arrest me. Should I be? Poirot asked mildly. Greaves stepped back to let them in. I loved her. Everyone knew it. Everyone pitied me for it. The poor director, mooning over his leading lady like some schoolboy. The letter, Monsieur Greaves, the one you wrote to Miss Harcourt. Tell me about it. Greaves sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I poured my heart out, told her everything I'd been feeling for months. I don't know what I thought, that she might feel something too. Perhaps that words on paper might move her in a way my presence never could. And she returned it unread? She handed it back to me during rehearsal, in front of the entire cast. Said she had no interest in amateur poetry from amateur directors. The humiliation was... He shuddered. I wanted to disappear. To die. Or perhaps to kill? Poirot suggested gently. No. Greaves looked up, anguished. I could never hurt her. Even after everything, I couldn't. I destroyed the letter that night, burned it in my fireplace. I wanted to burn the memory of my humiliation along with it, but I didn't kill her. Miss Marple had been examining the flat with her usual quiet thoroughness. Now she spoke up. Mr. Greaves, did you know that Vera had rewritten parts of the play? She was always changing lines. I told her to stick to the script, but she never listened. I mean more substantial changes. She wrote in her journal that she revised the entire final scene. Greaves frowned. That's impossible. I would have known. I'm the director. Every script goes through me. Unless, Poirot said thoughtfully, she made changes without telling you. Tell me, who handles the scripts during rehearsal? We each have our own copies. The actors have theirs. I have the master copy, and there's a stage manager's copy backstage for reference. And if Miss Harcourt were to rewrite her lines, where would she have done this work? In her dressing room, I suppose. She had a typewriter there, used it for correspondence. Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged glances. They had seen no typewriter in Vera's dressing room. Monsieur Greaves, Poirot said, we must search your theater more thoroughly. Will you accompany us? Chapter 5. Red Herrings and Revelations. By the afternoon, Poirot had assembled a small group at the Alwick Theatre. Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, Martin Greaves, and Timothy Wells the stagehand. Chief Inspector Morton had returned to Scotland Yard but had given Craddock authority to continue the investigation on site. "We are looking for a typewriter," Poirot announced. "One that was in Miss Harcourt's dressing room, but has since disappeared." "Why is a typewriter important?" Wells asked. "Because it was used to create new script pages that Miss Harcourt intended to use in the final performance. If we find those pages, we will understand what she planned to reveal. And if we understand that, we will understand why someone killed her." They searched systematically. The dressing rooms yielded nothing. The green room, the wardrobe room, the prop room, all were thoroughly examined. Finally, in a storage closet backstage, Wells discovered something wedged behind a stack of old scenery. "Here," he called. "It's a portable typewriter." Poirot examined it carefully. It was a Corona model, lightweight and designed for travel. A piece of paper was still threaded through the roller, showing the last thing that had been typed. "Martin, then do it, but know that the truth dies harder than flesh." "Vera, the truth? You mean the lie you've all been living?" "Gerald, who still pined for a woman who never loved him. Martin, who mistakes infatuation for art. And the Drakes, who run a failing theater on embezzled funds." The text ended there, unfinished. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed. She was going to expose everything during the performance, in front of everyone. Greaves looked sick. This is what she meant to say, instead of the scripted lines. It appears so, and someone discovered what she intended and decided to silence her permanently. "But wait," Craddock said. "If this was what Vera planned to say, why didn't she?" Gerald Penn said she started her usual lines, the ones in the original script, before she was stabbed. Poirot's eyes lit up. "Ah, now we come to the heart of the matter. You are correct, Inspector. She did speak the original lines." "Why?" Miss Marple had been studying the typewritten page. "Because someone switched the scripts," she said quietly, "just as they switched the knives." "Exactment." Poirot beamed at her. The killer's plan was most elegant. They knew Miss Harcourt intended to use her rewritten version, so they did two things. First, they ensured the knife was real. Second, they replaced the revised script with the original. But why? Wells looked confused. If they were going to kill her anyway... Because, Poirot explained patiently, the killer wanted her death to appear accidental, a tragic mistake during a theatrical performance. If Miss Harcourt had begun speaking her revised lines, exposing secrets and scandals, the murder would clearly have been motivated by what she was saying. But if she spoke the original, innocuous lines and died anyway, it could be explained as a terrible accident. Someone who made a dreadful error with the props. "So we're looking for someone who had access to both the prop room and Vera's dressing room during the interval," Craddock reasoned, "and who knew about her script changes." Mrs. Drake. Greaves said suddenly she found the typewriter. She must have found the revised script too, and Vera was going to expose her husband's embezzlement. But Poirot held up a hand. "Perhaps, but consider, Mrs. Drake is a kind woman who has spent her life caring for others. Would such a person commit cold-blooded murder? And more importantly, would she have the theatrical knowledge to plan such an elaborate deception? Then who?" Greaves demanded. "Who else had the means and the motive?" Before Poirot could answer, Gerald Penn arrived at the theater, summoned by a message from Craddock. He looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept. "You wanted to see me, Inspector?" "Mr. Penn," Poirot said, "I must ask you a difficult question. When did you discover that Miss Harcourt had rewritten the final scene?" Penn's face went white. How did you know?" "Because only someone who knew about the changes would understand the danger they posed. Someone who realized that Vera intended to humiliate you publicly during the performance. She showed me the script 2 days ago," Penn admitted, his voice breaking. "She wanted me to see it, wanted me to know what was coming. She said it would be her masterpiece, her final triumph over everyone who had held her back." "And what did you do?" "I begged her not to. Told her it would destroy the company. Destroy all of us. But she just laughed. Penn's hands clenched into fists. She said we all deserved it. That we were small-minded amateurs who had tried to keep her from her destiny. Did you tell anyone else about this? Craddock asked. Yes. I told Martin. I thought as director he should know what she was planning. All eyes turned to Greaves, who had gone very pale. Martin? Craddock said sharply. You knew about the script changes? Yes, Greaves whispered. Gerald told me the night before the dress rehearsal. I confronted Vera, tried to make her see reason, but she refused. She said the script was her property to do with as she wished. So you decided to stop her, Poirot said. You entered her dressing room during the interval. No, I didn't kill her. I swear on my life I didn't. Then who did? Penn demanded. If you knew what she was planning, if you had access to the scripts and the prop room. I didn't have access to the prop room, Greaves protested. Timothy keeps it locked. I couldn't have switched the knives even if I'd wanted to, but I did lose the key, Wells admitted miserably. 2 weeks ago, if someone made a copy, who had access to your jacket during that time? Poirot asked. It was hanging in the green room. Anyone could have gone through the pockets. They were at an impasse. Too many suspects, too many opportunities. The picture was becoming muddier rather than clearer. Miss Marple had remained silent throughout these exchanges, but now she spoke up. I wonder if we're approaching this in the wrong direction, she said thoughtfully. We're assuming the killer planned everything meticulously. The script switch, the knife switch, the timing. But what if it wasn't quite so deliberate? What do you mean, mademoiselle? Poirot asked with interest. In my experience, murders that look elaborate are often quite simple at their core. Someone wanted Vera dead, yes, but perhaps not because of what she planned to say. Perhaps simply because of what she was. Go on, Craddock encouraged. She was cruel, Miss Marple said simply. She humiliated people for her own amusement. She threatened Mrs. Drake's security. She mocked Mr. Greaves's feelings. She dismissed Mr. Penn's love. And she was about to leave the company entirely, moving on to the West End, leaving everyone else behind in her wake. You think one of them snapped? Craddock asked. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we should consider what each person was doing during those crucial minutes of the interval. Not what they might have done, but what they actually did. Poirot smiled. Once again, Mademoiselle Marple demonstrates the clarity of thought. Very well. Let us reconstruct the interval minute by minute. Over the next hour, they interviewed each person separately, building a timeline. 8:15 p.m., the second act ends. The interval begins. 8:16 p.m., most of the cast goes to the green room. Gerald Penn remains on stage, reviewing his blocking for the final scene. 8:17 p.m., Vera Harcourt goes to the wardrobe room where Mrs. Drake helps her change costumes. Miss Marple is present, having tea. 8:20 p.m., Martin Greaves is in his office, making notes on the second act performance. 8:22 p.m., Vera leaves the wardrobe room and returns to her dressing room. 8:25 p.m., Timothy Wells is on stage, resetting props for the final act. He places a theatrical knife on the prop table. 8:28 p.m., Clara Bennett brings tea to Vera's dressing room, but Vera dismisses her curtly. 8:30 p.m., Hugh Drake is in his office on the phone, arguing with a creditor. 8:32 p.m., Gerald Penn finally leaves the stage and goes to the green room. 8:35 p.m., the interval ends. Everyone returns to their positions for the final act. So, Poirot mused, between 8:22 and 8:32, Miss Harcourt was alone in her dressing room. That is when someone could have switched her script. And between 8:25 and 8:35, the prop table was set but unguarded. That is when the knife could have been switched. But who could have done both? Craddock asked. That is what we must discover, Poirot said. And I believe the answer lies not in what was done, but in what was left behind. He turned to Miss Marple. Mademoiselle, when you were in the wardrobe room with Mrs. Drake and Miss Harcourt, did you notice anything unusual? Anything that seemed out of place? Miss Marple thought carefully. The wardrobe key was missing from Mrs. Drake's chatelaine. We mentioned that already. But there was something else. She frowned. A perfume. I noticed it particularly because it wasn't Vera's usual scent. Vera wore something floral, roses, I think, but this was different, sharper, bergamot and lilac. The same perfume we smelled on the knife. Poirot said eagerly. Whose perfume was it? I don't know. I didn't recognize it as belonging to anyone in particular. But Timothy Wells had gone pale. Clara, he said quietly. Clara Bennett wears that perfume. I gave it to her for her birthday last month. A little shop in Covent Garden makes it specially, bergamot and lilac. Everyone turned to stare at the stagehand. You and Miss Bennett are? Craddock let the question hang. We've been walking out together for 6 months, Wells admitted. But she couldn't have done this. She's not capable of murder. Perhaps, Poirot said gently, we should ask her ourselves. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. Clara Bennett lived in a boarding house in Camden, a respectable establishment for young working women. When Poirot, Miss Marple, and Inspector Craddock arrived that evening, they found her in the common sitting room, mending costumes from theater. She looked up at their approach, and something in her eyes, a flicker of resignation, perhaps, told Poirot that she had been expecting them. Miss Bennett, Craddock said formally, we need to ask you some questions about the night of Miss Harcourt's death. I know, Clara said softly. She set down her sewing with careful precision. I've been waiting for you to figure it out. I thought I'd been so clever, but I should have known. Timothy said the famous Hercule Poirot was here. I should have run then. You admit to killing Vera Harcourt? Craddock's voice was sharp with surprise. No. Clara looked up, startled. I didn't kill her. I would never, but I know who did. At least, I think I do. Poirot sat down across from her. Then, perhaps, mademoiselle, you will tell us everything you know. From the beginning. Clara took a shaky breath. It started 2 weeks ago. I came to the theater early one morning. I wanted to practice my lines in private, where no one could hear me stumble over them. The door to Vera's dressing room was ajar, and I heard voices. Vera and Mrs. Drake. What were they saying? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Drake was begging Vera not to say anything about Mr. Drake's money troubles. She said if word got out that he'd been borrowing from the theater's accounts to pay gambling debts, they'd lose everything. Vera laughed. She said everyone's secrets would come out eventually, and Mrs. Drake should learn to accept that the truth always has its day. And you said nothing? Craddock asked. I should have, but I was frightened. If Vera knew I'd overheard, she might have turned on me too. She had a way of sensing weakness and exploiting it. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. A few days later, I was in the prop room helping Timothy organize things. That's when I noticed the real dagger was missing from its display case. When was this? Poirot asked sharply. 3 days before the dress rehearsal. I asked Timothy about it, but he said he'd moved it for cleaning. I didn't think anything of it until... She swallowed hard. Until I saw Mrs. Drake with it. The room went very still. You saw Mrs. Drake with the real dagger? Craddock leaned forward. When? The night before the dress rehearsal. I'd stayed late to work on costumes. My own costume needed altering, and Mrs. Drake had offered to help. When I went to find her in the wardrobe room, she was holding the dagger, just staring at it. When she saw me, she quickly put it in her sewing basket and said she was thinking of using it as a prop for a future production. And you believed her? Miss Marple asked. I wanted to. Mrs. Drake had always been kind to me, but the way she looked, so desperate, so frightened, I knew something was wrong. Clara's eyes filled with tears. During the interval on the night of performance, I went to Vera's dressing room. I was going to tell her to stop being so cruel, to leave Mrs. Drake alone. But when I got there, the door was open and I saw. What did you see? Poirot prompted gently. Mrs. Drake was at Vera's desk. She was taking papers, script pages, and replacing them with others from her apron pocket. She looked up and saw me, and the expression on her face. Clara shuddered. She wasn't the kind Mrs. Drake anymore. She looked like someone pushed too far, someone capable of anything. What did you do? Craddock asked. I ran. I went back to the green room and tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. If Mrs. Drake was switching scripts, and if she had the real dagger, I knew something terrible was going to happen. But I couldn't prove anything. I couldn't even be certain of what I'd seen. Why didn't you tell someone? Craddock demanded. Because by the time I convinced myself I needed to speak up, the final act had begun. And then Clara covered her face with her hands. Then Vera was dead, and it was too late. The perfume, Miss Marple said. Your perfume was on the knife handle. How do you explain that? Clara looked up, confused. My perfume? But I never touched the knife. I didn't go near the prop table. Yet your scent was there, Poirot said, and also in the wardrobe room, which you claim to have left before the interval ended. Understanding dawned on Clara's face. The costumes. I've been mending them all week, working with Mrs. Drake in the wardrobe room. My perfume would have been on everything I touched, including the gloves Mrs. Drake wore when she handled the knife. Gloves. Poirot's eyes lit up. What gloves? The white cotton gloves she uses when handling delicate fabrics. She was wearing them when I saw her in Vera's dressing room. I remember thinking it was odd at the time. Why wear gloves to handle papers? To avoid leaving fingerprints, Craddock said grimly. But she didn't think about the perfume transfer. Miss Bennet, I need you to come to Scotland Yard and make a formal statement. What will happen to Mrs. Drake? Clara asked, her voice small. That depends, Poirot said, on whether she intended murder or merely wished to prevent Miss Harcourt from speaking her revised lines. He rose to his feet. Come, Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple. We must return to the theater. There is one more thing I must verify before we confront Mrs. Drake. As they drove back through the darkening streets of London, Miss Marple spoke quietly. I've been thinking about Emily Drake, she said. She reminds me of Mrs. Harmon from my village, a good woman, devoted to her family, who made one terrible decision to protect someone she loved. You think Mrs. Drake did not intend murder? Poirot asked. I think she's not a natural criminal. Everything about her suggests someone acting in desperation rather than calculation. The question is, did she know the knife was real when she placed it on the prop table? That, Poirot said, is precisely what I intend to discover. At the theater, they found Mrs. Drake in the wardrobe room, mechanically sorting through costumes as though the familiar routine could ward off her thoughts. She looked up when they entered, and her face crumpled. I knew you'd come, she said. I've been sitting here waiting, wondering how long it would take, wondering if I should run, but where would I go? She laughed bitterly. I can barely afford bus fare, let alone escape to the continent. Mrs. Drake, Craddock began, but Poirot held up his hand. Madam, will you tell us what happened? All of it, from the beginning? Mrs. Drake sank into her chair, looking suddenly old. I found the revised script 3 days before the dress rehearsal. Vera had left it in her typewriter when she went to lunch. I read it, and Her voice broke. My Hugh isn't a bad man, Inspector. He has his faults, his temper, his pride, but he's not a criminal. He borrowed from the theater accounts, yes, but he was going to pay it back. He'd already started making arrangements. But if Miss Harcourt exposed him publicly, Miss Marple said gently, it would have ruined him, ruined us both. We would have lost everything. The theater, our home, our reputation. Hugh might have gone to prison. Mrs. Drake's hands twisted in her apron. I couldn't let that happen. I thought if I could just stop Vera from saying those lines, everything would be all right. So you switched the scripts? Poirot said. Yes, during the interval, when she went to change costumes. I knew she put her revised pages on her dressing table. I took them and replaced them with the original pages. I thought that would be enough. But it wasn't, Craddock said. You also switched the knives. Mrs. Drake's face went white. No, I would never kill anyone. Then explain the dagger, Poirot demanded. The real dagger, the one that killed Miss Harcourt. It was in your possession. I was mending it. Mrs. Drake cried. The hilt had come loose. It's an antique, you understand, quite delicate. Timothy asked me to fix it 2 weeks ago. I had it in my sewing basket, working on it during breaks. I just finished repairing it the day before the dress rehearsal. And where did you put it when you were finished? Poirot asked. I put it back in the prop room, in the display case where it belonged. Mrs. Drake looked genuinely confused. I would never have left it where someone could mistake it for a theatrical knife. The two knives looked similar, yes, but anyone who picked them up would immediately feel the difference. The real dagger is much heavier. Poirot exchanged glances with Craddock. Madam, you're saying you returned the dagger to its proper place? Yes, I swear it. Then, Poirot said slowly, someone else took it from the display case and placed it on the prop table where Gerald Penn would pick it up for the final scene. Mrs. Drake's face went from white to gray. But who? Who would? That, Poirot said, is what we must now determine. Inspector, I do not believe Mrs. Drake committed murder. She attempted to suppress evidence, to switch the scripts, but she did not place the real knife in the killer's hand. Then who did? Craddock demanded. We're running in circles. Poirot, every time we think we have an answer, it slips away. On the contrary, mon ami, I believe we are very close to the truth. But first, I must conduct one final experiment. Poirot turned to Mrs. Drake. The gloves you wore when you switched the scripts, do you still have them? Mrs. Drake nodded mutely and retrieved them from a drawer. White cotton gloves, stained with traces of stage makeup. Poirot sniffed them carefully. Ah, yes, the bergamot and lilac, just as I thought. He looked up at her. How long had you been working with Miss Bennet before the dress rehearsal? Nearly every day for 2 weeks. She was helping me with costumes. So her perfume would have permeated these gloves, would have been on everything in this room. I suppose so, yes. And when you switched the scripts in Miss Harcourt's dressing room, you were wearing these gloves? Yes, to avoid fingerprints, as Clara guessed. But you did not switch the knives? I swear on my life, I did not. Poirot nodded slowly. I believe you, madam, which means someone else, someone who had access to both the prop room and the prop table, made that fatal switch. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He turned to Craddock and Miss Marple. Come, we must gather everyone at the theater tomorrow morning, all of the players in this tragedy. For now I know the truth. You do? Craddock looked skeptical. Then why not arrest the killer now? Because, Poirot said quietly, I must be absolutely certain. And for that, I need one more piece of evidence, something only the true killer can provide. Chapter 7. The Drawing Room Scene. The following morning, the Alwick Theater was once again filled with people, though this time they gathered not to watch a performance but to witness a revelation. Poirot had requested that everyone connected with the case be present. Gerald Penn, Martin Greaves, Clara Bennet, Timothy Wells, Mr. and Mrs. Drake, and even Margaret Craddock, who had worked the coat check on the fatal night. Chief Inspector Morton had come from Scotland Yard, though he looked skeptical about Poirot's dramatic staging. I hope this isn't a waste of time, Poirot. We could arrest Mrs. Drake right now based on her confession to switching the scripts. But she did not commit murder, Poirot insisted. And it is murder we must solve, not the lesser crime of tampering with evidence. The group sat in the theater's first 3 rows, facing the empty stage where Poirot stood with Miss Marple seated in the front row, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. Poirot stood center stage, his hands clasped behind his back, his appearance as immaculate as ever despite the early hour. He surveyed his audience with those penetrating green eyes, and when he spoke, his accent was more pronounced than usual, a sign Craddock knew that he was deeply engaged with the puzzle. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, we are gathered here on this stage where 3 nights ago a woman died. You have all wondered, I think, how it was possible. How could someone be murdered in front of 10 witnesses, yet no one saw the crime committed? We all know how it was done, Hugh Drake said impatiently. Someone switched the knives. The question is who? Ah, but that is where you are wrong, Monsieur Drake. The question is not who, at least not at first. The question is why. Poirot began to pace slowly across the stage. You see, when I first examined this case, I made the same assumption as everyone else. I believed someone had taken the theatrical knife from the prop table and replaced it with the real dagger. But this assumption, she is incorrect. What do you mean? Morton demanded. The real knife was on the prop table. Penn picked it up and used it in the scene. Oui, this is true. But consider, when was the real knife placed there? During the interval, we assume. But who would take such a risk? The prop table is visible from several angles. Anyone passing by might see the switch being made. The theater was chaotic during the interval. Greaves protested. People coming and going. It would have been possible. Possible, yes, but also very dangerous for the killer. They would have to count on no one noticing, no one happening to walk past at the wrong moment. Poirot shook his head. No, M.E.S. Amos. The killer did not make the switch during the interval. Then when Craddock asked, leaning forward with interest, the killer made the switch much earlier, before the dress rehearsal even began. You see, there was never a theatrical knife on that prop table at all. The real dagger was there from the start. A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. But that's impossible, Wells protested. I set up the props myself before the performance. I would have noticed that the knife was real. The weight alone. Ah, but would you, monsieur? Think carefully. You have done this task many times, yes? Setting out props has become routine, automatic. You reach into the prop box, you take out the knife, you place it on the table. Do you truly examine it each time? Do you test the weight? Wells' face had gone pale. I assumed it was the right knife. It looked the same. Exactly so. The killer counted on your routine, your familiarity. They placed a real knife in the prop box before you came to set up, knowing you would not question it. But the theatrical knife, Miss Marple said quietly, still knitting. Where did it go? An excellent question, mademoiselle, and the answer reveals the identity of our killer. Poirot turned to face his audience directly. You see, the person who committed this crime had to accomplish several things. First, they had to gain access to the prop room to steal the real dagger from its display case. Second, they had to place that dagger in the prop box without being noticed. Third, they had to remove the theatrical knife so there could be no last-minute discovery of the switch. And fourth, most importantly, they had to ensure that Miss Harcourt would be standing in exactly the right position, speaking exactly the right lines when Gerald Penn made his thrust. The scripts, Clara said suddenly. Mrs. Drake switched the scripts back to the original version. Precisement. But Mrs. Drake did not know about the knife. She thought she was simply preventing Miss Harcourt from exposing secrets. She had no idea that by replacing those script pages, she was ensuring that Miss Harcourt would perform the scene exactly as the killer required. Poirot paused, letting this sink in. You see, if Miss Harcourt had spoken her revised lines, the ones exposing everyone's secrets, the blocking would have been different. She would have been moving around the stage, gesturing dramatically. Gerald Penn might not have had the opportunity to make that precise thrust. But with the original script, the staging was exactly as it had been in rehearsals. Miss Harcourt would stand still, her back to the window, while Penn approached from stage left and struck. The killer knew this because they had seen it rehearsed many times. "This still doesn't tell us who," Morton said impatiently. "Ah, but it does, Chief Inspector. For you see, the killer had to be someone with 3 specific qualifications. First, they needed detailed knowledge of theatrical staging and props. Second, they needed a key to the prop room, or access to the key long enough to make a copy. And third, they needed a motive strong enough to commit murder." Poirot's gaze swept across the assembled suspects. "Let's consider each of you in turn. Gerald Penn, you had motive certainment. Miss Harcourt had humiliated you, broken your engagement, and was about to expose your continued affection for her in front of an audience. But you did not have the opportunity. You were on stage during the crucial time when the knife would have been placed in the prop box." Penn sagged with relief. "Martin Greaves, you also had motive. Miss Harcourt had rejected your love, humiliated you publicly, and you had theatrical knowledge. But you, too, lacked opportunity. You were in your office during the critical period, and witnesses can confirm this." Greaves nodded, too drained to speak. "Clara Bennett, the understudy who had gained the most from Miss Harcourt's death. But you are too honest, mademoiselle. When you saw Mrs. Drake switching the scripts, you were frightened, not calculating. A murderer would have used that knowledge, not run from it." Clara's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Mrs. Drake, you had motive and opportunity. But as we have established, you did not switch the knives. You were attempting a lesser crime, not murder." "Then who?" Hugh Drake exploded. "For God's sake, Poirot, stop playing games." "I am not playing games, monsieur. I am revealing the truth." Poirot turned to Timothy Wells. "Tell me, Monsieur Wells, when did you realize that the key to the prop room had been copied?" Wells shifted uncomfortably. "I told you 2 weeks ago when I lost it for a few hours." "And where did you find it again?" "In my jacket pocket where it should have been." "Yet you told no one of this loss." "I didn't think it mattered. Nothing was stolen or disturbed." "Ah, but something was disturbed. The real dagger was removed from its display case for repairs, at exactly this time, was it not? Mrs. Drake had it for 2 weeks, mending the loose hilt, but she returned it to the display case the day before the dress rehearsal, a full 24 hours before Miss Harcourt's death." "So," Wells looked confused. "So someone took it again after Mrs. Drake returned it. Someone who had made a copy of your key. Someone who knew that Vera Harcourt was planning to rewrite the final scene and expose secrets because they had seen the revised script." Poirot walked slowly toward the group. "There is only one person who fits all these criteria. One person who had theatrical knowledge, access to props, knowledge of the script changes, and a motive that we have not yet discussed." He stopped directly in front of Martin Greaves. "Non, Monsieur Greaves, you are not the killer. But you knew who was, did you not? You knew because you confronted Miss Harcourt about her revised script, and she told you something you have kept hidden from us." Greaves' face had gone gray. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. Miss Harcourt told you that she was not working alone, that someone had helped her discover the secret she planned to expose. Someone who had access to private papers, financial records, personal correspondence." Poirot turned suddenly to face Margaret Craddock, who sat very still in her seat. "Miss Craddock, would you stand, please?" "What?" Inspector Craddock jumped to his feet. "Poirot, my niece has nothing to do with this. She only works the coat check. Does she mon ami, or does she do rather more than that?" Poirot's eyes never left Margaret's face. "You are a university student, mademoiselle. Studying what subject?" Margaret stood slowly, her face carefully composed. "Dramatic literature," she said quietly. "And you have ambitions to work in the theater professionally, yes?" "Many students do." "But you had a particular interest in the Alwick Theater, did you not?" Because your uncle was friends with the inspector who investigated when money first went missing from the theater's accounts 2 years ago. You knew about Hugh Drake's embezzlement long before anyone else. Margaret said nothing, but her jaw tightened. You also, Poirot continued, had access to the theater whenever you wished. You worked a coat check, but you arrived early and stayed late. Everyone was accustomed to seeing you backstage. No one thought twice about your presence. This is ridiculous, Margaret said, but her voice wavered slightly. Is it? Let me reconstruct what happened. You met Vera Harcourt several months ago and recognized in her a kindred spirit. Someone ambitious, someone willing to do whatever necessary to succeed. You saw an opportunity. You would help her rewrite the final scene, would provide her with the secrets that would make the performance sensational. In return, she would take you with her to the West End, would introduce you to producers and directors who could further your career. You can't prove any of this, Margaret said. Perhaps not yet, but I can prove you had a copy of the prop room key. When Timothy Wells lost his key, you took it. You knew the theater well enough to know where he kept his jacket. And you had ample opportunity. You made a copy and returned the original. Why would I do that? Because you needed access to props for your own theatrical ambitions. You had been writing plays, had you not? And you needed items to photograph for your portfolio. But more importantly, you needed access to the real dagger. Poirot began to pace again. Your plan was clever. You helped Vera create her scandal, but then at the last moment, you would ensure she did not actually perform it. You would switch the knives, and Vera would die in what appeared to be a tragic accident. The rewritten script would never be performed. The secrets would remain hidden in you. He paused. You would step forward with your own version of events. You would claim that Vera had confided in you, that she had enemies, that perhaps it was not an accident after all. You would become part of the drama, interviewed by newspapers, noticed by theater people, launched into the career you desired. That's insane, Margaret said, but her voice was rising. Why would I kill Vera? She was going to help me. Was she? Poirot asked gently. Or had she changed her mind? Had she realized that taking you to the West End would mean sharing credit, sharing the spotlight? Vera Harcourt did not share well, as we have all learned. I think she told you that your partnership was over, that she would perform her revised script alone and take all the glory for herself. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. And that would have left you with nothing, she said quietly. You had betrayed everyone's secrets to her, had enabled her cruelty, and for what? To be discarded like everyone else she used. Margaret's composure finally cracked. She promised, she cried. She said we were partners, that we would conquer the West End together. But 2 days before the performance, she laughed in my face. She said I was just a coat check girl playing at being a playwright, that she'd never intended to take me anywhere. So you killed her, Morton said flatly. I didn't mean to. Margaret's face crumpled. I just wanted to stop the performance, to prevent her from exposing everyone and getting everything she wanted while leaving me behind. I thought if I used the real knife, there would be an investigation. Everything would come out, and her triumphant debut would be ruined. But you did intend her to die, Poirot said. You knew that a knife thrust to the chest with a real blade would be fatal. You counted on Gerald Penn's precise staging, on his theatrical training that would make him thrust exactly where the script directed. I thought it would look like an accident, Margaret whispered. I thought people would believe it was a terrible mistake with the props. I didn't know Mrs. Drake would switch the scripts. I thought Vera would be speaking her revised lines, and everyone would think one of the people she was exposing had made a desperate, clumsy attempt to silence her. Instead, Miss Marple said softly, Mrs. Drake's interference made it look even more like an accident. Vera spoke the innocent lines from the original script, and her death seemed purely theatrical. Margaret sank back into her seat, her face in her hands. I didn't want to be invisible anymore, she sobbed. I didn't want to spend my life taking coats and watching other people live their dreams. Is that so terrible? Inspector Craddock looked stricken. Margaret, how could you? Because she was cruel, Margaret said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. Because she used people and discarded them. Because she was going to get everything she wanted while the rest of us suffered. I wanted her to fail for once. I wanted her to feel what it was like to have your dreams taken away. So you took away her life instead, Poirot said quietly. Chief Inspector Morton stood, his face grim. Margaret Craddock, I'm arresting you for the murder of Vera Harcourt. You don't have to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. As two constables led Margaret away, still sobbing, Inspector Craddock slumped in his seat. I vouched for her, he said hoarsely. I told everyone she was just a student, that she had nothing to do with the production, and all the while... You could not have known, Poirot said kindly. She played her part very well, the innocent bystander, the helpful niece. It is often those we trust most who are capable of the greatest deceptions. Miss Marple had put away her knitting and now stood, smoothing her skirt. The poor girl, she said. She reminds me of Mary Higgins from my village, a girl who was so desperate to be noticed that she set fire to her own house, thinking the drama would make people pay attention to her. Some people confuse notoriety with importance. Hugh Drake cleared his throat. What about my wife? Will she be charged? Morton considered this. Mrs. Drake interfered with evidence and attempted to suppress testimony that would have been relevant to the investigation. However, given the circumstances and the fact that she did not commit or intend murder, I expect the charges will be relatively minor. A good solicitor should be able to argue for leniency. Mrs. Drake burst into tears of relief, and Clara Bennett moved to comfort her. Gerald Penn stood slowly, looking dazed. So it was all for nothing. Vera's death, the secrets, everything. It was just about one person's ambition. Is it ever about anything else? Martin Greaves asked bitterly. Ambition is what drives us all in the theater. Margaret just took it further than most. No, Poirot said firmly. Ambition drives many people, but most do not resort to murder. Miss Craddock's crime was born not of ambition alone, but of entitlement, the belief that she deserves success regardless of the cost to others. That is very different. Chapter 8. The Final Curtain. 2 days later, Poirot and Miss Marple met for tea at Claridge's. The investigation was complete. Margaret Craddock was in custody awaiting trial, and the Alwick Theater had been temporarily closed while the Drake family decided its future. A sad business, Miss Marple remarked, adding a careful measure of milk to her tea. That young woman destroyed her own life trying to create a dramatic story. She forgot that real life isn't a play. There are no curtain calls, no chances to revise the ending. And in attempting to stop Miss Harcourt from exposing everyone's secrets, she created an even greater scandal. Poirot selected a small cucumber sandwich from the tiered serving tray. It is ironic, non? Mrs. Drake will face charges for protecting her husband, but the attention brought by the murder investigation has already exposed his embezzlement. The very thing she tried to prevent has come to pass. Though I hear, Miss Marple said, that the theater community has rallied around them. Several West End producers have offered to help reorganize the Alwick's finances. Sometimes good can come from tragedy. And the others? What will become of them? Well, Mr. Penn has been offered a role in a Shaftesbury Avenue production, finally getting his chance at the professional stage without Vera's shadow hanging over him. Mr. Greaves is talking about directing for the BBC. Clara Bennett has been asked to lead the Briar Lane players while they rebuild. And young Timothy Wells? He and Clara are engaged, I understand. They plan to run the theater together once it reopens. Miss Marple smiled. Young love endures, even in the darkest circumstances. Poirot sipped his tea thoughtfully. You know, mademoiselle, when I first met you at that theater, I did not expect to find such an astute observer of human nature. I could say the same of you, Monsieur Poirot, though I suppose we each have our methods. You with your psychology and your little gray cells, and I with my comparisons to village life. And both methods led us to the truth, Poirot said with satisfaction. Though I confess, I did not suspect Miss Craddock until very late in the investigation. Her position as Inspector Craddock's niece provided excellent cover. Yes, people always underestimate the young, Miss Marple agreed, just as they underestimate the elderly. We both benefited from that underestimation in this case, I think. Poirot raised his teacup in a salute. To underestimation, then, and to the truth that is found not by looking for the obvious, but by observing what people reveal when they think they are hidden. They touched cups gently, the delicate china making a soft chiming sound. "Tell me," Miss Marple said after a moment, "how did you know to look at Margaret? What gave her away?" "Several small things," Poirot admitted. "The way she positioned herself always within earshot, but never at the center of attention. The way she asked questions that seemed innocent but gathered information. And most telling, the way she reacted, or rather did not react, when the body was discovered. Everyone else was shocked, horrified, distressed. But Miss Craddock, she was composed. Too composed for someone witnessing a murder for the first time. Ah, yes, I noticed that too. She was watching everyone else's reactions rather than having her own." Miss Marple nodded. "In my experience, people who are planning dramatic events tend to forget that they must also appear surprised by them." "And you, mademoiselle, when did you suspect her?" "When she mentioned that the theatrical knife and the real dagger looked identical. How would a coat-check girl know that, unless she had handled both knives, compared them, made the switch herself?" Poirot's eyes lit up. "But of course, I should have caught that immediately. You have the advantage of me, Miss Marple." "Not at all. I simply pay attention to the small details that others overlook. It's a habit one develops when one has spent years observing village life. The same patterns repeat themselves, whether in St. Mary Mead or in London." "Then, perhaps," Poirot suggested, "we should work together again should the opportunity arise. The combination of your village wisdom and my psychological insight could be quite formidable." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I'm not sure London, or the criminal element, could withstand such a partnership, Monsieur Poirot. But should fate bring us together again, I would be delighted to assist." They finished their tea in companionable silence. Two detectives from different worlds who had found common ground in the pursuit of truth. Outside, the London afternoon faded into evening, and somewhere in the city, the theaters were preparing for their evening performances, full of drama, passion, and the eternal hope that this time the play would end as it should. The Alwood Community Theater remained closed for 3 months following the murder. When it finally reopened, it was under new management, a consortium of theatrical producers who had been moved by the plight of the Drake family and had purchased the theater for a fair price, ensuring that Hugh Drake could repay his debts and retire with dignity. The first production in the renovated space was not A Lady Dies Laughing. That play would never be performed again, but rather a gentle comedy about second chances and redemption. Clara Bennett played the lead to warm reviews, and Timothy Wells designed sets that were praised for their ingenuity and charm. Gerald Penn did indeed make his West End debut, though he never achieved the stardom he had once craved. He discovered, to his surprise, that he preferred teaching drama to performing it, and he eventually became a respected instructor at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Martin Greaves found success directing for radio and, later, television. His nervous energy, once a liability, became an asset in the fast-paced world of broadcasting. He never directed for the stage again. Mrs. Emily Drake received a suspended sentence and community service for her role in tampering with evidence. She spent her final years volunteering at a theater museum, cataloging costumes and props, finding peace in preserving theatrical history rather than living it. Margaret Craddock was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in prison. She wrote a memoir about her crime that was rejected by every publisher who received it. The story, they said, was too melodramatic, too focused on the perpetrator's feelings rather than the victim's humanity. It seemed that even in confession, Margaret could not escape her tendency towards self-dramatization. Inspector Craddock, devastated by his niece's betrayal, retired from the police force earlier than planned. He moved to the countryside with his wife and spent his remaining years gardening, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life rather than investigating death. As for Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple, they did indeed encounter each other again in subsequent years, though never again in circumstances quite so theatrical. They maintained a cordial correspondence, exchanging observations about human nature and the curious cases that came their way. And in the archives of Scotland Yard, filed among countless other cases of passion, jealousy, and ambition, the file on the Alnwick Theatre murder remained, a testament to the dangerous intersection of art and reality, and to the truth that sometimes the deadliest performances are those played out not on stage, but in the shadows behind the curtain. Epilogue. On a gray morning in December 1937, Hercule Poirot received a letter addressed in a careful, feminine hand. It was from Miss Jane Marple, writing from St. Mary Mead. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to share with you a small postscript to our theatrical investigation. I recently received a letter from Clara Bennett, now Clara Wells, who writes that the Alnwick Theatre has commissioned a new play. It's to be a mystery, rather fittingly, about the danger of secrets and the cost of ambition. She tells me that the play is dedicated to the memory of Vera Harcourt, who showed us that even the smallest stages cast the longest shadows. I thought you might appreciate the poetry of that sentiment, even if the reality behind it was considerably darker. Clara also mentioned that they found Vera's revised script among her papers. She asked if they should burn it or preserve it. I advised preservation. After all, it was part of what happened, and we should not forget even the uncomfortable truths. They are placed in the theater's archive, where it serves as a reminder that some performances are better left unperformed. I have been thinking about poor Margaret Craddock. Her trial was reported extensively in our local papers, and the villagers have been full of opinions about young women with ambitions above their station. I find their certainty exhausting. The truth is never so simple, is it? Margaret committed a terrible crime, but she was also a young woman desperate to be seen, to matter. That doesn't excuse what she did, but perhaps it explains it. In St. Mary Mead, we have our own small dramas. Nothing so dramatic as murder, thank goodness, though we have had our share of intrigue. Mrs. Price Ridley has been discovered in a compromising correspondence with a gentleman in the next village. Miss Hartnell's nephew has run off to join a theatrical company, much to her horror, and the vicar's wife has taken up painting, with results that are ambitious, shall we say. Life goes on as it always does, with its mixture of comedy and tragedy, its small triumphs and disappointments. Perhaps that is what makes both village life and theater so compelling. They are both reflections of the human condition, just played out on different stages. Should you ever find yourself in need of a retreat from the complexities of London, you would be most welcome to visit St. Mary Mead. I can promise you excellent tea, a comfortable bed, and more than enough human nature to observe. With warm regards, Jane Marple. Poirot read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer, where he kept correspondence from people he respected. Then he sat back in his chair and gazed out at the London afternoon, thinking about stages and shadows, about ambition and consequence, about the many ways people construct their own tragedies. The theater, he murmured to himself. She is like life, but with better lighting and worse outcomes. And in his comfortable flat, surrounded by his perfectly arranged possessions and his methodically organized case files, Hercule Poirot smiled at the memory of a small, shrewd woman from St. Mary Mead who understood that human nature was much the same whether performed on a stage or lived in a village. The curtain, as they say, had fallen, but somewhere, always, another was rising. The end.